So welcome back to Chapter 1, Module 2. So what is psychology? And we're going to look at what psychologists do and then also historical theory. So let me just get this bigger. Make sure you can still see me. Okay, so the learning outcomes of this module is to describe the origins in psychology and identify who's made significant contributions, and also looking at what fields of psychologists do. So psychologists engage in conducting research. So there's two different types of research. So there's basic or pure research. So that's just research for its own sake. So potentially a psychologist is just really interested in a specific idea or theory, and so they decide to do research. Applied research is looking at ways to research, to conduct, to answer questions and find solutions to real world personal or social problems. So potentially this semester we're going to cover intelligence. So maybe a psychologist recognizes like an IQ gap between segments of populations of people. So they might do some research to address that. So potentially looking at is it a social problem, is there personal, what's going on, and how can they implement maybe strategies to try and narrow that gap or things like that. So applied research is research that is intended to answer a real world personal or social problem. There's different fields of psychology. So I'm sorry that some of these PowerPoints look a little bit funny. I think when I upload them to LMS, it changed the format. So hold on a second. Okay. Still getting used to this format here. So there's different fields. So there's clinical psychologists. So potentially some of you might have seen a clinical psychologist before. So lots of time clinical psychologists work with people that are suffering with different mental health issues or things like that. So they might, somebody might have, say, generalized anxiety disorder. So they go to a clinical psychologist to do some like cognitive behavioral therapy and practicing some techniques on managing anxiety and working through some of those issues that they may have. There's counseling psychology, which would be similar to that. So somebody might go for counseling just to work through their problems. There's educational psychologists. So there's psychologists that work directly in the field of education, and their goal is to kind of help in the school system or things like that. They might do IQ testing. They might look at placement settings, things like that. Developmental psychologists, they look at the field of like lifespan development. So that's another course that I teach here at the college. So they would study development from conception all the way until death, and they might look at changes. So what are some universal changes that people see? What are some kind of cultural specific changes and things like that? So they might study, they do study human development. There's personality psychologists that would look at different kind of studying the different types of personality and personality traits, things like that. Social psychologists, I find social psychology one of the most interesting fields in psychology. So some of you potentially have seen or heard about the Stanford prison experiment. So that was a huge social experiment where they had students in Stanford University. So this was done pre-ethics, which you're going to talk about later, before they had ethics the way they do now. And Philip Zimbardo, the psychologist in that experiment, he had university students divided into two different groups. So he had university students that signed up for this experiment, and one half was assigned to be the prisoners, and then the other half was designed to be the prison guards. And they had all these different rules, and they went through this experiment. And what happened was that the prison guards actually started abusing the prisoners. And they really took on these roles that they were in. So it was a huge social experiment. It was actually really harmful for a lot of people, and it was stopped early. And you can never repeat it today, but that's what a social psychologist might study. So they might look at the bystander effect. So why is it that people are safer? If you are in a crisis and you say you get into an accident or something, you're actually safer or more likely to get help if there's only one person watching. There's been cases where someone's had a heart attack and there's been lots of people around them, but nobody does CPR. Everybody assumes that somebody else is going to. Or I always say to my students after learning about the bystander effect, if you ever witness an accident, make sure that you call 911 because there's been cases where everybody thinks somebody else called 911 and actually they're waiting for an ambulance to come and no one's called. So that's the bystander effect. So that might be something social psychologists are interested in. Environmental psychologists would study our relationship with the environment. They might look at why people behave in certain ways towards the environment and ways that we can foster positive environmental relationships. Experimental psychologists do just that. They run experiments. We have industrial and organizational psychologists. So they would be interested in studying company productivity and what are some ways that we can improve productivity within companies and what's the ideal number for group work. So what group is too small, what group is too big, how often should you change the groups that people are working in, what happens when groups get too cohesive, things like that. Cognitive psychologists look at how we learn, study, remember. They're interested in the process of language acquisition, sensation and perception and all of those things. Health psychologists, so how do we take care of our own health? How can we improve that? They might look at the effects of stress on the body. What's the effect of when we don't sleep enough and things like that. Sports psychologists, so sports psychologists work in the sports industries and they, sorry if I bug bite. They would look at what are some ways that people gear up for a big game and what are some ways that you can envision yourself winning the gold medal and things like that and kind of going through those processes. And then forensic psychologists study crime and they look at why is it that eyewitness testimony is so flawed and how does memory impact crime and then things like that. So there's lots of different fields in psychology and there's lots of things that psychologists would study. So a little bit about the history, so where psychology comes from. So interested in psychological topics has existed throughout history. So philosophers have theorized about the human behavior, and they looked at theories of introspection. So the father of psychology, his name is William Wundt, and he developed the very first. Do I have? Right here. Sorry. He developed the very first theory, or not the very first theory, but he it had psychology emerge as a scientific discipline. So that's why he's called the father of psychology. So what William Wundt developed was the theory called structuralism. So structuralists attempt to break down the human experience into sensations, feelings, and images. So what William Wundt kind of believed was that you could break down the human experience and human sensation into tiny pieces of information. And so what he would have people or his clients, I guess, do is they would do this process of introspection. So that's the process of looking inward. I think that there was we don't have the definition there, but it's the process of looking inward. So some textbooks describe this process of introspection as he would have clients come into a laboratory and then listen to a metronome. So if there's any musicians out there, it's what keeps the beat for music. And they would be what are you thinking, feeling, what are the sensations that you're experiencing and things like that. So he really believed that you could break down the human experience into components, feelings and images. So what we know now about humans and how we function and the way our brain works is that we don't do this. So we don't break down every piece of sensory information in our environment. If we did do that, we would be totally overwhelmed. So it is not something that that's not something that we do. But it was the first time that he tried to do it in a scientific way. So that's a picture of William Wundt. So one of the first laboratories that were developed in Canada was by James Mark Baldwin at the University of Toronto. And it was a developmental and experimental psychologist. So he was a founding member of the American Psychological Association in 1982. So next we have 1892, not 1982, 1892. So we have the theory of functionalism. So if you think of structuralism, William Wundt on one side of the spectrum. So again, we're breaking down the human experience into each individual sensation. We have functionalism, which is kind of the other way. So he was influenced by the work of Charles Darwin, in evolution. So he was interested in looking at how we function. So what are some ways that we go through, how does natural selection happen, and how does this process kind of occur to allow us to adapt and survive into our environment? So he was interested in studying behavior and how and why do humans adapt the way they do and behave the way they do. So he sought to answer how behavior and mental processes help us adapt in our environment in a functional manner. So I kind of describe it as like a puzzle. So William Wundt was like interested in looking at, like if you had a picture of a jigsaw puzzle, he's interested in looking and analyzing every single piece of that puzzle, which is not really something that people do. Whereas now we see like we're looking at like the bigger picture, right? And so that's kind of where like these theories differed. So functionalism was looking at how humans function in their environment. He wasn't necessarily interested in breaking down it into tiny pieces, whereas William Wundt was like, okay, let's like dissect every little piece of this jigsaw puzzle and try to understand why humans act, feel, and see and function and perceive the world the way they do. So we know that that's not how it works. So behavioralism was founded by John Watson, and it was associated with Pavlov and then also Skinner. So behaviorists were interested in studying observable behavior. So they weren't looking at kind of sensation and perception and how do we break everything down. They were looking at how do people function in their environment. So one of the first experiments done in behavior in the School of Behaviorism was with, I don't know if I have a slide here on it. No. Okay. Was with what they called the Little Albert experiment. And so what happened in this experiment, which again, we're going to talk about ethics later, but this would not be able to take place now because of our code of ethics. But they had little Peter, which was like a baby, come into a laboratory. And what they would do is they wanted to see like if they could kind of create association. So little Albert, was in a laboratory and they would expose who he had no fear of white rats prior to this experiment. And so what they did was every time they exposed little Albert to this white rat, they would like bangs like cymbals or something loud behind the baby's head and it would startle him. So they did this enough times until they made this like till little Albert made an association with white rat, loud noise, scared. So eventually every time he would see the white rat, he would just start crying. So Mary Cover Jones, which we don't have her listed here, she was like a founding person in in like reversing these processes. So she continued this study with someone called Little Peter. And so it was a similar study, but Little Peter, they used a little white bunny. And so they kind of conditioned Little Peter to be afraid of the bunny in a similar way. But then they tried to see if they could reverse this. So they would, every time Little Peter would see a bunny, they would give Little Peter like a treat, and they did this enough times until little Peter no longer associated the bunny with fear, but with something positive. And so that is kind of one of the founding ways that we look at like exposure therapy and things like that and how we can reverse those connections. But behavioral psychologists are interested in studying the observable behavior. So they thought that thoughts, emotions, and other mental processes are invisible. They can't study those scientifically, so we're just going to study behavior itself. And then we have the Gestalt psychology. So this would be founding kind of the foundation of what we now know as cognitive psychology. And so Gestalt psychology emphasized, they have this saying, the sum is, perception is greater, than the sum of its parts. And so what that means is that Gestalt psychologists emphasize the tendency to organize perceptual input into whole patterns and images. So that instead of looking at kind of when we go back to that idea of the jigsaw puzzle with William Wundt, and structuralism. Gestalt psychology is like looking at the bigger picture. So they believe that we do not organize everything into tiny sensations, but we're looking at whole patterns. Sorry, I keep wanting to point with my fingers to my screen. Realize you can't see that. I'm getting used to this video lecturing, but so the whole patterns is what they were looking at. So they would say, really what goes on in our society is we do not analyze every single piece of sensory data. If we did do that, we would be completely overwhelmed. So what we do as humans is we like make assumptions, and we organize those sensations into patterns and to make it meaningful experiences. So this is kind of where like the phi phenomenon would come in, or illusion of movement. So we don't analyze every single piece of data. We analyze like whole pictures. And so I'm going to try to see here. I'm just going to pause it for a second. I don't know if I can stop. Okay, I'll try. I was going to see if I could find a YouTube video, but maybe I'll link it later. But we look at, sorry, I can hear my dog barking, my car alarm's going off. All right, anyway, so we look at whole patterns. So if anyone's ever, or even think about like I'll use this as an example. You go to a traffic light. Sometimes when you're at a red light, it looks like the light is moving from like red to green, but that you perceive movement there. But in reality, there is no movement. The red light turns off, the green light turns on. Those are two separate lights, but our brain naturally puts those things together. Let me see if I can